My husband parked a moving truck in the driveway of the luxury home right next door to ours. He stepped out, helped a heavily pregnant woman down from the cab, kissed her cheek, and walked across our manicured lawn to where I stood on the porch. He looked me dead in the eye and said she was having his son, and that I needed to make a welcome basket and help her unpack. If I could not respect the mother of his heir, I could pack my bags and leave his house. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just handed him the divorce papers, and the very last page completely destroyed his life. My name is Simone, and I am 35 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind an arrogant man who actually built the kingdom he is standing in. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta, I learned early that nobody hands you anything. My mother worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, and I spent my evenings studying numbers determined to build a life where I never had to worry about a past due bill. By 30, I had built my own private equity firm from the ground up. I became a wealth manager who turned thousands into millions. I was the financial backbone of my marriage to Terrence, a man who ran a mid-sized logistics company that I secretly bankrolled. But to Terrence and his toxic family, my ambition was a flaw. A woman's worth in their eyes was measured by what she could provide in a nursery, not a boardroom. And after 3 years of our quiet fertility struggles, Terrence decided my financial spreadsheets were not enough to make me a real wife. It was 9 o'clock on a bright Saturday morning. The Georgia heat was already settling over our exclusive gated community. I was standing on the front stone porch of our home, sipping my matcha latte, enjoying the rare quiet of the weekend. That peace shattered when the deep rumble of a massive moving truck echoed down our cul-de-sac. I watched it slowly back into the long sweeping driveway of the vacant $5 million estate directly next to ours. I assumed we were finally getting new neighbors. Then I saw Terrence's black luxury SUV pull up right behind the moving truck. My husband stepped out of the driver's side. He did not look toward our house. Instead, he walked around to the passenger side and opened the door like a perfect gentleman. A young woman stepped out. She looked no older than 26, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and a tight-knit maternity dress that showcased a very prominent baby bump. Terrence placed his hand tenderly on the small of her back, leaned in and kissed her forehead. My stomach plummeted, but my feet stayed firmly planted on the porch. I refused to let my knees buckle. He whispered something to her, pointing proudly toward the sprawling stone house. And then he turned and walked across the freshly cut grass toward me. He did not look ashamed. He did not look guilty. He walked with the arrogant stride of a man who believed he held absolutely all the cards. As he stepped up onto the porch, I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the morning humidity. I looked at the young woman, then back at him. "What is this, Terrence?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. He adjusted his gold designer watch, not even bothering to meet my eyes. "Her name is Sierra," he stated, his tone flat and authoritative. "She is having my son. I bought her this house so I can be close to my heir. You are going to go inside, make a nice welcome basket, take it over there and help her unpack." The sheer audacity of his words hung heavily in the warm air. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline of a cruel joke, but his face remained stone cold and deeply entitled. "I am sorry," I said softly. "You want me to help your pregnant mistress unpack her boxes?" Terrence finally looked at me, his eyes narrowing with deep disdain. "Do not play the victim, Simone. You chose your spreadsheets and your private equity firm over giving me a family. You cared more about acquiring corporate assets than giving me a child. A man has needs. A man needs a legacy. Sierra is providing that for me. So yes, you are going to go over there and welcome her to the neighborhood. Because if you cannot respect the mother of my child, you can pack your bags and leave my house today." He weaponized my demanding career and our deeply painful fertility struggles in one single calculated breath. He expected me to break down. He expected me to fall to my knees sobbing, begging him to reconsider, begging him not to throw away our 5-year marriage. He wanted the ego boost of two women fighting over his attention and his supposed wealth. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my matcha latte. The warm liquid grounded me, keeping my heart rate steady. I looked past his shoulder to where Sierra was directing the movers, pointing a manicured finger at a set of expensive velvet dining chairs. Then I looked back at the man I had married, the man whose failing logistics company I had quietly kept afloat for years behind the scenes. "I will not be making a basket, Terence," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "But I will let you get back to your new family." He scoffed, a short and ugly sound of triumph. "Suit yourself. Just remember whose house you are standing in." He turned his back on me and walked back across the manicured lawn to his mistress, wrapping his arm around her waist as they proudly walked through the grand double doors of the house next door. I did not scream. I did not throw my ceramic mug against the brick siding. I simply turned around, walked back into my beautiful high-ceilinged foyer, and locked the heavy oak front door. The silence of my empty house was deafening, but my mind was already moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Terence thought he had checkmated me. He thought because his name was listed first on the mortgage of our primary residence, he held all the power in our dynamic. He thought he could flaunt his blatant infidelity in my face and force me into absolute submission out of fear of losing my luxurious lifestyle and my social standing. What Terence conveniently forgot was that while he played the big-shot chief executive officer for his friends and his mother, I was the wealth manager who actually moved the chess pieces on the board. I walked straight into my home office, the very room he constantly claimed was the sole reason for our marital demise. I sat down at my custom mahogany desk, opened my laptop, and bypassed my standard personal email. I logged directly into my secured offshore account portals and my firm's private financial databases. For the next 3 hours, while Terence and Sierra laughed and unpacked designer baby clothes in the massive house next door, I systematically began restructuring every liquid asset we shared. I moved investment funds, locked down corporate credit lines, and flagged suspicious withdrawals from his various business accounts. It did not take long to find the massive bleeding hole in his company finances. I uncovered a dummy limited liability company. It was a phantom corporate entity he had recently created to quietly purchase the $5 million house next door. He had been heavily embezzling from his own logistics company to play a wealthy sugar daddy, completely oblivious to the fact that his company's operational credit lines were secured by collateral that my private equity firm entirely controlled. I picked up my phone and dialed my lead corporate attorney. The phone rang exactly twice before he answered. "Good morning, Simone," he said, "working on a beautiful Saturday." "Good morning, David," I replied, my eyes rapidly scanning the damning financial data illuminating my screen. "I need you to initiate a complete and thorough audit of Terrence's logistics company immediately. Prepare the necessary paperwork for a hostile corporate restructuring. Call in his debts, all of them." David paused on the other end of the line. "Simone, if we pull those bridge loans, his entire company will be completely insolvent by the end of the month. He will lose absolutely everything." I know, I said, turning my leather chair to look through my office window, watching as Terence enthusiastically carried a massive wooden baby crib into the house next door. "And David, draft my divorce papers. I want them completely ironclad. Make sure you highlight the infidelity clause from the post-nuptial agreement he signed 5 years ago." "Consider it done," David said, his tone shifting to pure business. I hung up the phone and closed my laptop. Terence wanted to order me out of his house. He wanted to demand I serve the woman who was carrying the child I could not conceive. Let him think he was the king of the castle. Let him enjoy his wonderful weekend playing house. Because by the time I was finished with my audits, I would not just be taking the castle away from him. I would be legally owning the very ground it was built on. I spent the next 3 hours sitting in my home office, watching the progress bars on my screen fill up as millions of dollars shifted securely out of joint accounts and into protected trusts. Terence had always been careless with passwords. He used the same simple combination of his birth year and his college fraternity for everything. It took me less than 10 minutes to access his personal banking portal. What I found there almost made me laugh out loud. He had practically drained his personal savings to put the down payment on that house next door, and he was currently floating his daily expenses on high-interest credit cards. He was a man pretending to be a billionaire while drowning in a kiddie pool of debt. The next day was Sunday. In Terrence's family Sunday dinner at his mother's house was not an option, it was a mandatory performance. Miss Ruby ruled her dining room like a courtroom judge and attendance was required. I decided to wear my favorite emerald green silk dress. I paired it with the diamond studs I bought for myself after closing my first major acquisition. If I was walking into the lion's den, I was going to look like the woman who owned the zoo. I arrived 15 minutes late on purpose. I parked my car, walked up the driveway, and pushed open the heavy front door. The smell of baked macaroni and cheese-collared greens and fried chicken filled the hallway. I could hear laughter coming from the formal dining room. I walked in my heels, clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The laughter died instantly. I looked at the long oak table. Every seat was taken. And sitting right at the head of the table, in the exact leather chair that had been my designated spot for the last 5 years, was Sierra. She was wearing a tight pink maternity shirt that proudly displayed her baby bump. Terrence was sitting right next to her, his arm resting casually on the back of her chair. Across from them sat Terrence's younger brother Andre and his wife Claire. At the opposite end of the table sat Miss Ruby presiding over the feast, with a smug expression on her face. Miss Ruby did not even bother to greet me. She picked up a massive silver serving spoon and scooped a huge portion of macaroni and cheese onto a plate. She passed it directly to Sierra. "Eat up, baby," Miss Ruby said, her voice booming so everyone in the room could hear. "We need that strong black king in your belly growing right. We need a real legacy for this family, not like some people who just dry up before they even try." The entire table fell silent. Andre looked down at his plate, suddenly very interested in his napkin. Terrence smirked, cutting into his chicken. Sierra giggled, placing a hand over her pregnant belly and looking at me with wide, innocent eyes. It was a calculated, vicious insult designed to humiliate me in front of the entire family. They expected me to run out of the dining room in tears. They wanted to break my spirit so completely that I would just accept my new reality as the discarded first wife. Before I could even pull up a spare chair, Claire leaned forward. Claire was a white woman who read one self-help book a month and believed she was a certified therapist. She reached across the table and tried to touch my arm with a look of aggressive fake sympathy. "Simone, I know this seems hard right now," Claire said, using her softest, most patronizing voice. "But I really think this is a beautiful opportunity for us to build a modern, blended family. I just bought this amazing book on sister wives energy. It is all about decentering your ego to make room for Terrence's truth. You should really read it. We just need to focus on the baby and let go of our selfish desires." I looked at Claire's outstretched hand until she awkwardly pulled it back. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply walked over to the sideboard, picked up a spare dining chair, and wedged it right between Terrence and Sierra. I sat down smoothly, smoothed my silk dress over my knees, and reached for the pitcher of iced tea. I poured myself a tall glass, took a refreshing sip, and then opened my designer purse. I pulled out a crisp white envelope and dropped it directly onto Sierra's dinner plate, right next to her macaroni and cheese. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Sierra," I said with a warm, bright smile. "Since you are my new neighbor, I thought I should personally deliver your homeowner association's special assessment fee. The neighborhood committee just installed a brand new biometric security gate. The fee is $4,500. It was due last Friday. Late fees accrue at a rate of $50 a day." Sierra stared at the envelope like it was a live grenade. She looked frantically at Terrence. Terrence slammed his fork down on the table, his face flushing with anger. He snatched the envelope off her plate and shoved it into his pocket. "Do not talk to her about money, Simone," he snapped. "I will pay the damn bill. I own that house. You are just trying to intimidate her because you are jealous." I took another slow sip of my iced tea, looking over the rim of the glass at my husband. I let the silence stretch for a few agonizing seconds. I did not correct him. I did not tell him that his phantom logistics company actually purchased the house, and that my private equity firm had just initiated a hostile takeover of his entire corporate portfolio. Let him play the big shot provider in front of his mother and his mistress. Let him puff out his chest and claim ownership of a property that was currently being absorbed into my offshore trust. I just smiled, picked up my fork, and served myself some collard greens. I am not jealous, Terence, I replied smoothly. I just believe in handling my business. Over the next 3 weeks, Sierra got incredibly comfortable. Too comfortable. She took Terrence's command that I needed to respect her entirely to heart. Because she lived right next door, she started treating my house like it was her personal country club. One Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting in my living room reviewing acquisition contracts when my front door opened. Terrence had given her a spare key. Sierra waddled in carrying a clipboard and trailing an expensive interior designer behind her. She did not even bother to knock. She walked straight into my kitchen and started opening my custom mahogany cabinets. "Excuse me," I said, closing my laptop. "Can I help you find something in my house?" Sierra waved her manicured hand dismissively. "Terrence said your money is our money now since we are a family. I am having the nursery next door completely remodeled. We are importing Italian marble for the baby's bathroom, and I need to hire your personal chef to meal prep for me. The doctor says I need a strictly organic diet for the heir. Send him over to my kitchen tomorrow morning." She stood there completely entitled, expecting me to throw a fit. Instead, I gave her a polite nod. "Of course, Sierra. Only the best for the baby. Have your designer send the invoices directly to my assistant. I will make sure they are taken care of." Sierra looked slightly disappointed that I had not fought back, but the greed quickly won over. She smiled triumphantly and marched out of my house, leaving a trail of expensive perfume in her wake. I did exactly what I promised. I paid for the imported Italian cribs. I paid for the nursery decorator. I paid for the organic meal deliveries. But I did not use my personal money. I charged every single ridiculous expense to a very specific corporate credit card tied directly to Terrence's failing logistics business. I was letting him dig his own financial grave, one designer baby blanket at a time. The absolute peak of his arrogance came 2 days later. Terrence stormed into my home office, interrupting a conference call with my board of directors. He threw a massive stack of legal documents onto my desk. It was a $2 million corporate loan application. He needed a massive injection of cash to expand his logistics company, or more accurately, to cover the massive hole he had blown in his accounts by buying a luxury house for his mistress. But because his credit was completely leveraged, the bank required a guarantor with liquid assets. He needed my signature. "Sign it, Simone," he demanded, pointing a finger in my face. "If you do not guarantee this loan, I am filing for divorce tomorrow morning. I will take you to court. I will take half your wealth, half your private equity firm, and I will leave you with absolutely nothing while I build an empire with Sierra. You owe me this for failing to give me a child." He thought he was trapping me. He thought he was using my fear of a messy public divorce to extort $2 million from my accounts. I looked at the papers. I looked at the arrogant, foolish man standing in front of my desk. I put on an award-winning performance of a desperate, terrified woman holding on to her crumbling marriage. I picked up my favorite gold pen. I let my hand tremble just a little bit as I signed my name on the dotted line, effectively guaranteeing his loan and locking my firm in as the primary collateral holder. Terrence snatched the signed papers off my desk, laughing out loud at how easily I had folded. He turned on his heel and walked out the door to go celebrate his victory with his new family. The second I heard his car pull out of the driveway, my trembling hand went completely still. My terrified expression melted into a cold, hard stare. I picked up my phone and dialed my lead corporate attorney. "He signed it," I said softly into the receiver. "The collateral is officially locked. Initiate the hostile corporate restructuring immediately." The entire room fell into a suffocating silence. Terence kept his eyes glued to his plate, cutting a piece of fried chicken, as if his mother had not just insulted his wife of 5 years. Andre shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but remained completely mute, terrified of challenging his older brother or his mother. Sierra just sat there, a smug little smile playing on her lips, as she rubbed her belly, soaking up the validation she had so desperately craved. I stood near the doorway, letting the heavy insult hang in the air. I refused to give them the reaction they wanted. I did not storm out of the house. I did not raise my voice or throw my purse. Instead, I walked over to the corner of the dining room, pulled a heavy wooden chair from the antique desk, and dragged it right to the table. I wedged it squarely between Terence and his mistress. Sierra shifted uncomfortably as I sat down, smoothing my skirt over my knees and reaching for a linen napkin. Before I could even serve myself a spoonful of greens, Claire leaned forward. Claire was Andre's wife, a white woman who consumed one pop psychology book a month and firmly believed she was the family therapist. She reached across the table and attempted to place her hand over mine, her face twisted into an expression of aggressive fake sympathy. Simone. I know this seems really difficult right now, Claire said, using that soft, patronizing voice she reserved for situations she did not understand. But I genuinely think this is a beautiful opportunity for us to build a modern, blended family. Terrence is just living his truth. I actually just bought this amazing book on sister wives energy. It is all about decentering your ego to make room for a collective family dynamic. We just need to focus on the baby and let go of our selfish individualistic desires. I stared at Claire's pale hand hovering over mine until she awkwardly pulled it back. She really had the audacity to sit in a house my money helped pay for and tell me to decenter my ego for my husband's mistress. Thank you for the book recommendation, Claire. I replied, my voice perfectly even and entirely devoid of warmth. I will be sure to add it to my reading list right after I finish reviewing my corporate asset portfolios. Andre aggressively cleared his throat, trying to cut the tension, while Miss Ruby rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath about nasty attitudes. I ignored them all. I calmly served myself a modest portion of dinner, poured a glass of sweet tea, and ate in perfect, unbothered silence. I let them squirm. I let the guilt and the awkwardness marinate around the table while I enjoyed Miss Ruby's cooking. When I finished my meal, I dabbed the corners of my mouth with my napkin and slowly opened my designer handbag. I pulled out a crisp white envelope with a corporate logo stamped on the corner. I reached past Terence and dropped the envelope directly onto Sierra's empty plate. Since you are officially my new neighbor, Sierra, I thought I should save the mail carrier a trip and personally deliver your homeowner association's special assessment bill, I said, offering her a warm, bright smile that did not reach my eyes. Sierra looked down at the envelope, her smug expression faltering. What is this? She asked, her voice losing its previous confidence. The neighborhood committee just finalized the installation of a brand new biometric security gate at the front entrance of the subdivision, I explained, keeping my tone light and conversational. The mandatory assessment fee for every property owner is $4,500. It was due last Friday. Late fees accrue at a rate of $50 a day until the balance is cleared. You might want to get a cashier check over to the management office by tomorrow morning. Sierra stared at the piece of paper like it was covered in poison. She immediately looked to Terence, her eyes wide and panicked. Terence dropped his fork, his face flushed with hot anger as he snatched the envelope off her plate and shoved it aggressively into his shirt pocket. Do not talk to her about money, Simone, he snapped, his voice rising in defense of his mistress. I will pay the damn bill. I own that house. You are just trying to intimidate her because you are bitter. I took another slow, refreshing sip of my sweet tea, looking directly over the rim of my glass at the man I had married. I let the silence stretch for a few agonizing seconds, locking eyes with him until he had to look away. I did not correct his delusion. I did not tell him that I had already spent my Saturday morning digging through his accounts. I did not announce to the table that his phantom logistics company had actually purchased the property, or that my private equity firm was currently in the process of a hostile takeover of his entire corporate portfolio due to his massive defaulted debts. Let him play the big shot provider in front of his mother. Let him puff out his chest and claim ownership of a multi-million-dollar property that was currently being quietly absorbed into my offshore trust. I am not bitter, Terence, I replied smoothly, setting my glass down on the table. I just believe in handling my business. I stood up, pushed my chair back in, and picked up my handbag. I thanked Miss Ruby for the dinner she had tried to poison with her words, wished Andre and Claire a wonderful evening, and walked out the front door without looking back. Over the next 3 weeks, Sierra got incredibly comfortable in her new role. Because she lived right next door, she took Terrence's command that I needed to respect her entirely to heart. She started treating my property like it was an extension of her own personal country club. One Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting in my living room reviewing acquisition contracts when my front door swung open. Terrence had given her a spare key without asking me. Sierra waddled in, carrying a clipboard and trailing an expensive interior designer behind her. She did not even bother to knock. She walked straight into my custom kitchen and started opening my mahogany cabinets, inspecting the contents like she owned the place. "Excuse me," I said, closing my laptop and standing up from the sofa. "Can I help you find something in my house?" Sierra waved her manicured hand dismissively, barely glancing in my direction. "Terrence said your money is our money now since we are a family. I am having the nursery next door completely remodeled. We are importing Italian marble for the baby's bathroom, and I need to hire your personal chef to meal prep for me. The doctor says I need a strictly organic diet for the heir. Send him over to my kitchen tomorrow morning to take my orders." She stood there completely entitled, her chin raised high, expecting me to throw a fit or start screaming. She wanted a fight. She wanted to run back to Terrence and tell him how mean I was being to the mother of his child. Instead, I gave her a polite nod. "Of course, Sierra," I said, my voice dripping with fake compliance. "Only the best for the baby. Have your designer send all the invoices directly to my assistant. I will make sure they are taken care of immediately." Sierra looked slightly disappointed that I had not fought back, but the greed quickly won over. She smiled triumphantly, whispered something to her designer, and marched out of my house, leaving a trail of expensive, heavy perfume in her wake. I did exactly what I promised. I paid for the imported Italian cribs. I paid for the nursery decorator. I paid for the organic meal deliveries. But I did not use a single dime of my own personal money. I charged every single ridiculous, exorbitant expense to a very specific corporate credit card tied directly to Terrence's failing logistics business. I was letting him dig his own financial grave, one designer baby blanket at a time, completely unaware that I was the one holding the shovel. I looked down at Claire's pale hand resting on my forearm. I did not pull away immediately. I just stared at her perfectly manicured fingers until the awkwardness seeped into her bones and she slowly retracted her hand, clearing her throat to break the heavy silence. "Sister wives," I repeated, letting the words roll around in my mouth like a bad piece of fruit. "That is a fascinating concept, Claire. Tell me, does that book also have a chapter on how to divide the property taxes, or is that strictly an ego thing?" Andre choked on his sweet tea, covering his mouth with a napkin. Terrence shot me a warning glare from across the table, his jaw clenched tight. "Watch your mouth, Simone," he warned. "Claire is just trying to be supportive of the situation." Supportive. Right. I picked up my fork and took a slow, deliberate bite of the macaroni and cheese. It was perfectly seasoned, just like the trap I was currently laying. I chewed, swallowed, and dabbed the corners of my mouth with my linen napkin. The entire table was watching me, holding their breath, waiting for the explosion. They wanted the angry, unhinged wife stereotype. They wanted me to flip the table, scream at the mistress, and storm out so they could all shake their heads and justify Terrence's infidelity. Instead, I calmly reached down beside my chair and picked up my leather designer tote. I unclasped the gold hardware and pulled out a crisp, heavy white envelope. It had the official seal of our luxury neighborhood homeowner association stamped in the top left corner. I leaned forward and slid the envelope smoothly across the polished oak table. It stopped right next to Sierra's plate, bumping gently against her silver fork. Sierra stopped chewing. She looked down at the envelope, then up at me. Her fake innocence was suddenly replaced by genuine confusion. "What is this?" she asked, her voice losing its previous smugness. "Consider it a welcome to the neighborhood gift," I said, my voice dripping with honeyed southern politeness. "Since you are officially living in the estate next door, I wanted to make sure you were fully up to date on the community requirements. The homeowner association just voted to install a brand new biometric security gate for the subdivision. The special assessment fee is $4,500 per household." Sierra's eyes widened in panic. She instinctively pulled her hands back as if the envelope were on fire. She had never paid a bill that large in her life. "It was due last Friday," I continued, not breaking eye contact with her. "Since it is late, it is currently accruing a $50 daily penalty. I highly recommend you take a cashier check to the management office first thing tomorrow morning. They are absolutely ruthless about putting liens on properties." Terrence slammed his hands flat on the table, making the silverware rattle against the plates. His face turned a deep, furious shade of crimson. He reached over, snatched the envelope away from Sierra, and shoved it aggressively into the breast pocket of his polo shirt. "Do not ever talk to her about money, Simone," he barked, his voice echoing off the dining room walls. "I will pay the damn bill. I own that house. You are just trying to intimidate her because you are threatened by her presence." I picked up my crystal wine glass, gently swirling the deep red liquid inside. I let his words hang in the heavy air. I own that house. The delusion was almost comical. He truly believed that because he had funneled embezzled corporate funds into a dummy limited liability company to buy the property, he was the untouchable king of the cul-de-sac. He had absolutely no idea that my private equity firm had already initiated the hostile takeover of his entire logistics company, effectively absorbing all its assets, including that dummy corporation. He did not own the house. He was just a squatter in a property that was rapidly becoming mine. But I was not going to tell him that. Not yet. A good wealth manager knows exactly when to reveal her hand. "I am not threatened, Terrence," I said softly, taking a sip of my wine. "I just believe that adult women should understand the financial responsibilities of the roofs over their heads. But if you want to foot the bill, by all means write the check." Miss Ruby slammed her serving spoon into the bowl of mashed potatoes. "You think you are so smart with your little finance degrees and your fancy business suits? A real woman knows how to keep a man warm at night. A real woman gives him children. You can sit there and act high and mighty, but at the end of the day, Sierra is the one carrying my grandson. She is the future of this family." I looked directly at Miss Ruby. For 5 long years I had bitten my tongue to keep the peace with this toxic matriarch. I had paid for her roof repairs, funded her lavish church donations, and smiled through her constant subtle digs at my career. The peace treaty was officially shredded. "You are absolutely right, Miss Ruby," I said, my tone completely unbothered and ice-cold. "Sierra is carrying the future of your family. And I am so glad you all have exactly what you deserve in each other." I stood up gracefully, smoothing the fabric of my silk dress. I did not wait for dessert. I picked up my bag, wished Andre and Claire a wonderful evening, and walked out the front door. I could hear Terrence loudly reassuring Sierra as I walked down the driveway, promising her that I was just a bitter, barren woman who would soon be out of their way. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in audacity. Because Sierra lived right next door, she took Terrence's mandate that I needed to respect her as an open invitation to invade my space. She assumed that my calm departure from that Sunday dinner meant I had accepted my fate as the defeated first wife. One Tuesday afternoon, I was in my home office reviewing the preliminary audit reports on Terrence's logistics company. The numbers were even worse than I had anticipated. He had not just embezzled for the house, he was bleeding his own company dry to fund a lifestyle of private jets and designer jewelry for a woman he had known for barely a year. Suddenly, I heard my front door open. Terrence had given Sierra a spare key to my house without my permission. I listened to her heavy footsteps walking across my imported hardwood floors. She did not bother to knock on my office door. She simply pushed it open. She was carrying a thick binder full of fabric swatches and paint samples, followed closely by a woman wearing thick framed glasses who looked wildly uncomfortable. Simone Sierra announced, walking into my office, like she was the chief executive officer of my life. Terrence said, "Your money is our money now since we are a family. I am having the nursery next door completely remodeled. We are importing Italian marble for the baby's bathroom." I closed my laptop, slowly masking the financial ruin of her baby daddy that was currently displayed on my glowing screen. "Is that right?" "Yes," she said, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "And the doctor says I need a strictly organic diet for the health of the air. So I need you to send your personal chef over to my kitchen tomorrow morning. He needs to prep all my meals for the week. Terrence said you would cover the grocery costs." I looked at the interior designer who was staring at her shoes, desperately wishing she were anywhere else. Then I looked at Sierra. She was standing in a house I paid for, demanding the services of a chef I employed to feed the child my husband conceived through ultimate betrayal. Most women would have called the police for trespassing. I simply opened my desk drawer and pulled out a specific corporate credit card. It was the card tied directly to Terrence's rapidly collapsing business account. "Of course, Sierra," I said, sliding the heavy metal card across my mahogany desk. "Only the best for the baby. Have your designer charge everything to this account. The cribs, the marble, the organic groceries. Do not spare a single expense." I let Terrence fold that homeowner association bill and tuck it into his pocket like a badge of honor. He puffed out his chest, looking around the table to make sure his mother and his brother saw how easily he handled his bitter wife. Miss Ruby nodded in approval, her mouth full of cornbread. I simply finished my glass of wine, stood up, smoothed my dress, and told them all to have a blessed Sunday. I walked out of that dining room with the absolute certainty that I was about to ruin his life. Over the next 3 weeks, Sierra took Terrence at his word. She truly believed he was a multi-millionaire logistics mogul who untouchably owned the $5 million estate next door. And because she lived exactly 60 feet away from my front porch, she decided that my boundaries no longer existed. She took his mandate that I needed to respect her as an open invitation to invade my space and treat me like her personal concierge. I was sitting in my living room on a Tuesday afternoon, reviewing the final stages of the hostile takeover of Terrence's company when I heard the front door unlock. Terrence had given her a spare key without asking me. I listened to the sound of her expensive sandals slapping against my imported hardwood floors. She did not bother to knock. She did not call out my name. She walked straight into my custom kitchen and started opening my custom mahogany cabinets, inspecting the contents like she was conducting a health inspection. I closed my laptop and stood up from the sofa. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Can I help you find something in my house?" Sierra turned around, resting one hand on her pregnant belly and waving a manicured finger at me with the other. "Terrence told me that your money is our money now since we are a family. The doctor says I need to be on a strict organic diet for the health of the air. I need you to send your personal chef over to my house tomorrow morning. He needs to prep all my meals for the week. You can just add it to your grocery tab." She did not stop there. She walked over to my kitchen island and dropped a thick leather binder right onto the marble countertop. It was full of fabric swatches, paint samples, and printed mood boards. And while we are at it, she continued, leaning heavily against the counter, "I am having the nursery completely remodeled. We are importing Italian marble for the baby bathroom, and I am ordering 2 custom cribs from Milan. Terrence said you would cover the invoices since he is tying up his liquid assets in his business expansion. He says you owe us this much for being so difficult about the pregnancy." I looked at the thick binder of nursery demands. Then I looked at the 26-year-old girl standing in my kitchen, completely entitled. Her chin raised high, expecting me to throw a massive fit. She wanted a fight. She wanted me to start screaming and throwing plates so she could run back to Terence crying about how unhinged and dangerous the barren first wife was being to her and the unborn baby. She wanted to prove to him that I was exactly the bitter woman Miss Ruby claimed I was. But a seasoned wealth manager never reacts emotionally when a bad investment is begging to be liquidated. You do not interrupt your enemy when they are making a catastrophic financial mistake. I gave her a soft, accommodating smile. It was the same smile I used when negotiating with corporate executives who were about to lose their pensions. "Of course, Sierra," I said, walking over to the kitchen island and gently tapping the leather binder. "Only the best for the baby. You just have your interior designer send all the invoices directly to my assistant. I will make sure they are paid immediately, and I will have Chef Thomas bring over a menu for your organic meal prep this evening." Sierra blinked, her mouth opening slightly in surprise. She had geared up for a massive screaming match, and I had just handed her a blank check. She clearly did not know what to do with my total compliance. She smiled triumphantly, whispered a quick thank you that sounded more like a gloat, and waddled back out of my house, leaving a heavy trail of cheap floral perfume in her wake. As soon as the front door clicked shut, I went back to my home office and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I bypassed my personal black cards and pulled out a sleek, heavy metal corporate credit card. It was a card tied directly to Terrence's failing logistics business account. The exact same business account that was currently bleeding cash, defaulting on its high-interest bridge loans and spiraling toward total insolvency. I picked up my phone and called my executive assistant. I instructed her to put that specific corporate card on file for all of Sierra's nursery and dietary expenses. I told her to approve every single charge that came through, without question. Over the next few weeks, I let Sierra go absolutely wild. She spent money like it was water flowing from an endless spring. I paid for the imported Italian marble tiles. I paid for the custom Milanese cribs that cost more than a luxury car. I paid for the daily organic private chef deliveries, the silk maternity robes, and a massive crystal chandelier she just had to have for the baby playroom. My assistant would forward me the digital receipts, and I would watch with deep satisfaction as thousands of dollars were drained directly from Terrence's operating budget. I charged every single exorbitant expense right back to his corporate account. I was letting him dig his own financial grave, one designer baby blanket at a time. He was so busy playing the powerful patriarch, so consumed by the ego trip of having a beautiful young woman carrying his child in a mansion next door, that he completely stopped checking his accounting department. He had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the shovel, and that every time Sierra swiped that card, she was driving another nail into his coffin. His financial hemorrhage accelerated much faster than even my most aggressive projections had calculated. By the end of the month, Terence was starting to look physically exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes were impossible to hide. The designer bills from Sierra were piling up. His phantom limited liability company was draining his personal cash reserves to pay the mortgage on her house, and his logistics trucks were breaking down in the yard without the funds for basic maintenance. The illusion of his wealth was rapidly fracturing. He was a desperate man, backed into a corner of his own making, watching his empire crumble while trying to keep up appearances for his mistress and his mother. And desperate men always make fatal mistakes. They always overplay their hand to save their bruised egos. Terence was about to make the biggest mistake of his entire life, and he was going to deliver it right to my desk. The financial bleeding I had orchestrated was accelerating faster than even my most aggressive projections. By the end of the month, Terence was visibly deteriorating. The dark circles under his eyes were impossible to hide with his usual arrogant smirk. The designer bills from Sierra were piling up on his desk. His phantom limited liability company was draining his personal cash reserves just to pay the mortgage on her house, and his logistics trucks were breaking down in the yard without the necessary funds for basic maintenance. The illusion of his immense wealth was rapidly fracturing. He was a desperate man backed into a corner of his own making, watching his empire crumble while desperately trying to keep up appearances for his pregnant mistress and his demanding mother. And desperate men always make fatal mistakes. His biggest mistake arrived on a rainy Thursday evening. I was sitting in my home office reviewing a quarterly earnings report for one of my client portfolios. The house was quiet save for the sound of rain hitting the large glass windows. The heavy mahogany door to my office suddenly swung open. Terrence marched in, bringing the smell of damp wool and stale scotch into my pristine workspace. He did not bother to knock. He walked directly to my desk and slammed a massive leather-bound stack of legal documents right on top of my keyboard. I slowly took off my reading glasses and looked up at him. "What is this, Terrence?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. "It is a commercial loan application," he stated aggressively, unbuttoning his suit jacket and placing his hands on his hips. $2 million. I am expanding the logistics company. We are acquiring a new fleet of trucks and opening a distribution hub in Charlotte. The bank has already approved the capital injection, but because the business is scaling so rapidly, my current assets are tied up in operational costs. They need a secondary guarantor to underwrite the loan. I need your signature." I looked down at the thick stack of papers. He was lying through his teeth. There was no new fleet of trucks. There was no distribution hub in Charlotte. He needed a massive immediate injection of cash to cover the massive hole he had blown in his accounts by buying a luxury house for his mistress and funding her ridiculous, extravagant lifestyle. But because his credit was completely leveraged and his company was quietly suffocating from the embezzlement, the bank required a guarantor with heavy liquid assets. He needed my private equity firm to back his debt. I opened the folder and slowly flipped through the first few pages, letting the silence stretch. "Why would you need my signature, Terrence?" I asked, feigning confusion. "You told your mother at Sunday dinner that your business was posting record profits. You told Sierra that my money was practically irrelevant compared to your wealth. If the company is doing so well, surely the bank can use your existing commercial real estate as collateral." Terrence slammed his hand down on the edge of my desk, his face twisting into an ugly mask of rage. "Do not play games with me, Simone," he snarled, leaning over the mahogany surface to intimidate me. "You know exactly how corporate finance works. My cash is tied up in investments for our family, for my heir. You are my wife. It is your legal and moral obligation to support this family. I have carried you for 5 years while you played boss at your little boutique firm. Now it is time for you to step up and do your part." I leaned back in my leather chair, folding my hands in my lap. "And if I choose not to sign a $2 million liability?" Terrence stood up straight, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He had been waiting for me to resist. He wanted to deliver his ultimate threat. "If you do not sign those papers right now, I am calling my lawyers tomorrow morning and filing for divorce. We live in an equitable distribution state, Simone. I will drag you through a public, humiliating court battle. I will take half of your personal wealth. I will take half of your precious private equity firm. I will take this house, and I will leave you with absolutely nothing. You will be a broke, barren, divorced woman, and I will build an empire right next door with the woman who actually knows how to be a real wife to me. You owe me the signature for failing to give me a child." He delivered the blow with the precision of a man who had studied my deepest insecurities for 5 years. He thought he was trapping me. He thought he was using my fear of a messy public scandal and the painful reality of our fertility struggles to extort $2 million from my carefully protected accounts. He expected me to shatter into a million pieces. I looked at the legal documents. Then I looked at the arrogant, foolish man standing in front of my desk. What Terrence lacked in business acumen, he made up for in pure, unfiltered audacity. By demanding I guarantee this loan, he was legally tying his sinking ship to my battleship. But what he did not realize was that the specific lending institution he was using was a subsidiary of a massive banking conglomerate that my private equity firm heavily influenced. If I signed as the guarantor and he defaulted, the debt would not just ruin him. It would give my firm the legal right to seize all his corporate collateral. He was literally handing me the keys to his entire life. I knew exactly what role I needed to play. I let my shoulders drop, physically shrinking into my chair. I forced my breathing to become shallow and rapid. I looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes playing the part of the desperate broken woman, clinging to the remnants of her shattered marriage. "Please, Terence," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. "Do not do this. Do not take my firm. It is all I have left." Terence laughed. It was a cold, vicious sound that echoed off the walls of my office. "Then sign the damn papers, Simone. Sign the papers and maybe I will let you stay in the guest room once the baby is born." I slowly reached across my desk and picked up my favorite heavy gold pen. I let my hand tremble just enough for him to notice. I turned to the final page of the guarantor agreement, took a deep, shaky breath, and signed my name on the dotted line. I initialed every single rider and annex, effectively locking my firm in as the primary collateral holder for his entire corporate structure. Terence snatched the signed papers off my desk so fast he almost tore the thick paper. He looked at my signature, a massive grin spreading across his face. He had won. He had successfully bullied his wife into funding his mistress. "You finally did something useful," he sneered, tapping the folder against the palm of his hand. "I am going next door to celebrate with my real family. Do not wait up." He turned on his heel and walked out the door, his arrogant stride fully restored. I listened to his heavy footsteps echo down the hallway. I heard the front door open and slam shut. I heard the engine of his luxury SUV start in the driveway as he drove the 60 feet to Sierra's house. The second the sound of his engine faded into the rain, my trembling hand went completely still. The terrified, broken expression melted off my face, replaced by a cold, hard stare. I picked up my cell phone from the desk and dialed my lead corporate attorney. He answered on the first ring. "He signed it, David," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "The documents are fully executed. The collateral is officially locked." "Excellent work, Simone," David replied, the sound of typing clicking in the background. "His accounts are already flagged for critical insolvency. How long do you want to give him before we pull the plug?" I stood up from my desk and walked over to the large window. Through the rain and the darkness, I could see the bright, warm lights glowing from the massive windows of the house next door. I could see the silhouette of Terence wrapping his arms around Sierra's pregnant waist. "Let him enjoy his weekend," I said softly, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. "Initiate the hostile corporate restructuring on Monday morning. I want his entire logistics company absorbed by the end of the week." He stood there in my office, his chest puffed out, waiting for the tears. He expected me to shatter. He expected me to drop to my knees and beg him not to throw away our 5-year marriage. He was trying to financially trap me to fund his double life, using the very real threat of a public humiliating divorce as his ultimate weapon. In his mind, I was just a woman desperate to keep her husband, terrified of the social stigma of being a discarded barren wife. But Terence made one fatal miscalculation. He assumed I was as financially illiterate as the young woman he moved in next door. He assumed I did not read the fine print of the commercial lending agreements my own private equity firm underwrote. I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents resting on my custom mahogany desk. He wanted $2 million to expand his logistics company. The reality was that his company was completely drowning. He had drained his operating accounts to buy designer bags, imported cribs, and a $5 million house for his mistress. The bank required a secondary guarantor because his credit was entirely leveraged. What Terence did not realize was that the specific lending institution he was using was a subsidiary of a massive banking conglomerate that my private equity firm heavily influenced. If I signed my name on that dotted line, I was not just guaranteeing his loan. I was legally locking my firm in as the primary collateral holder for his entire corporate structure. If he defaulted on his payments, which I knew he absolutely would, within a matter of weeks, the debt would give my firm the immediate legal right to seize all his corporate assets. He was literally handing me the keys to his entire life, completely convinced he was bullying me into submission. I knew exactly what role I needed to play. A good wealth manager, never interrupts a bad investment when it is begging to be liquidated. I let my shoulders drop, physically shrinking into my leather chair. I forced my breathing to become shallow and rapid. I looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes, playing the part of the desperate, broken woman clinging to the remnants of her shattered marriage. "Please, Terrence," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. "Do not do this. Do not take my firm. It is all I have left. I have worked my entire life to build it." Terrence laughed. It was a cold, vicious sound that echoed off the walls of my pristine office. "Then sign the papers, Simone. Sign the papers, and maybe I will let you stay in the guest room once my son is born. Do your duty as a wife for once in your life." I slowly reached across my desk and picked up my favorite heavy gold pen. I let my hand tremble just enough for him to notice. I turned to the final page of the guarantor agreement. I took a deep, shaky breath and signed my name on the dotted line. I meticulously initialed every single rider and annex, making absolutely sure the contract was ironclad. Terrence snatched the signed papers off my desk so fast he almost tore the thick paper. He looked at my signature, a massive, triumphant grin spreading across his face. He had won. He had successfully bullied his wife into funding his mistress. "You finally did something useful," he sneered, tapping the heavy folder against the palm of his hand. "I am going next door to celebrate with my real family. Do not wait up for me." He turned on his heel and walked out the door, his arrogant stride fully restored. I listened to his heavy footsteps echo down the hallway. I heard the front door open and slam shut. I heard the engine of his luxury SUV start in the driveway as he drove the 60 feet to Sierra's house. The second the sound of his engine faded away, my trembling hand went completely still. The terrified, broken expression melted off my face, replaced by a cold, hard stare. I picked up my cell phone from the desk and dialed my lead corporate attorney. He answered on the first ring. He signed it. "David," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "The documents are fully executed. The collateral is officially locked." "Excellent work, Simone," David replied, the sound of typing clicking in the background. "His accounts are already flagged for critical insolvency. How long do you want to give him before we pull the plug?" I stood up from my desk and walked over to the large window. I could see the bright, warm lights glowing from the massive windows of the house next door. I could see the silhouette of Terrence wrapping his arms around Sierra. "Let him enjoy his weekend," I said softly, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. "Initiate the hostile corporate restructuring on Monday morning. I want his entire logistics company absorbed by the end of the month." 4 weeks passed. During that time, Terrence lived in a state of absolute delusion. He strutted around the neighborhood like a king, completely oblivious to the fact that my legal team was systematically dismantling his empire behind closed doors. Every time Sierra swiped that corporate credit card for her organic groceries or her imported Italian marble, she was driving another nail into his financial coffin. The default notices started rolling in, but Terrence was too busy planning his next grand gesture to check his corporate mail. That grand gesture arrived on a bright Saturday morning. I was woken up at 8 o'clock by the sound of heavy metal poles clanking together and unfamiliar voices shouting instructions. I threw on my silk robe, walked over to my bedroom window, and pulled back the heavy curtains. I stared in absolute disbelief. A massive white catering tent was being erected right in the middle of my meticulously landscaped backyard. A team of florists was busy wrapping my stone columns in expensive blue and gold floral arrangements. A disc jockey was setting up massive speakers on my patio. They were throwing a baby shower. But instead of hosting it at the $5 million estate Terrence had bought for his mistress next door, they had decided to move the entire party onto my property. I walked downstairs and stepped out onto the back patio. The Georgia humidity was already heavy in the air. Miss Ruby was standing near my swimming pool, wearing a wide-brimmed church hat and barking orders at a group of caterers carrying silver chafing dishes. "Excuse me," I said, my voice slicing through the noise of the workers. "What exactly is going on in my backyard?" Miss Ruby turned to look at me, placing her hands on her hips. She did not look embarrassed. She looked entirely entitled. "We are setting up for the baby shower, Simone. Sierra has a lot of guests coming, and her backyard does not have the proper landscaping for photographs. Your lawn is much bigger." Terrence said it was fine since this is all family property anyway. I looked around at the sheer scale of the event. There were at least 10 tables covered in expensive blue silk linens. There was a massive throne chair situated right under my oak tree, clearly reserved for Sierra. The audacity was suffocating. They had literally invaded my sanctuary to celebrate the ultimate betrayal, completely confident that I would just sit inside and cry. Before I could respond, Claire came rushing out of my back door carrying a clipboard. She was wearing a brightly colored sundress and a huge fake smile. "Simone, I am so glad you are awake," Claire chirped, completely ignoring the fact that she had just walked through my house without permission. "We are going to need you to clear out the main refrigerator in your kitchen. The caterers need space to store the 3-tier custom cake. And remember what we talked about regarding Sister Wives energy. This is a day for healing and celebrating Terrence's truth. We really need you to be a team player today." I looked at Claire. Then I looked at Miss Ruby. I could have called the police and had them all escorted off my property for trespassing. I could have flipped the catering tables and ruined their perfect Saturday morning. But a much better idea was forming in my mind. My private equity firm had officially completed the hostile takeover of Terrence's logistics company 2 days ago. I legally owned his trucks. I owned his corporate bank accounts. And because he had used a dummy corporation funded by embezzled company money to buy the house next door, I now legally owned that property too. I had the eviction notice sitting in a manila envelope on my desk. I gave Claire a slow, calm smile. "You know what, Claire, you are absolutely right," I said smoothly. "This is a day for celebrating truths. I will go clear out the refrigerator for the cake. You just make sure everyone is having a wonderful time." Miss Ruby scoffed, turning back to the caterers. "See, she finally learned her place. About time she started acting like a supportive wife." I turned around and walked back into my house. Let them set up the flowers. Let them set up the throne. Let them invite all of their friends and family to my backyard. They wanted a public spectacle. They wanted an audience to witness my humiliation. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, but I was going to rewrite the ending. I walked into my home office, picked up the thick manila envelope containing the eviction notice, and placed it right on top of my purse. The baby shower was about to be a day they would never forget. The days following my phone call to my legal team were a masterclass in silent execution. While Terrence strutted around our gated community like a titan of industry, my firm systematically dismantled his corporate structure brick by brick. By Wednesday, his main operating accounts were frozen under the guise of an internal audit. By Friday, my holding company possessed the legal deeds to his entire commercial fleet. He was so completely distracted by playing the wealthy patriarch for the woman next door that he ignored the urgent voicemails from his own accounting department. Sierra continued to aggressively swipe that corporate card, draining the absolute last drops of his liquidity to pay for organic avocados and custom silk curtains. He was a dead man walking, and he did not even know his heart had stopped beating. Exactly 4 weeks after he signed his life away on my mahogany desk, I was awakened at 7 in the morning by the heavy thrum of diesel engines and men shouting outside my bedroom window. I sat up, pushed the heavy duvet aside, and walked to the glass doors leading to my balcony. I looked down and stared in absolute disbelief. An army of event planners was currently invading my meticulously manicured backyard. They were unloading a massive white catering tent, dragging heavy wooden dance floors across my imported grass, and hanging elaborate blue and gold floral arrangements from the branches of my ancient oak tree. They were throwing a baby shower. But instead of hosting it at the $5 million estate Terrence had bought for his mistress next door, they had unilaterally decided to move the entire party onto my property. I tightened the belt of my silk robe and walked downstairs. The Georgia morning humidity was already settling over the patio as I stepped outside. Miss Ruby was standing near my heated swimming pool, wearing a wide-brimmed church hat and barking orders at a group of caterers who were carrying heavy silver chafing dishes. "Excuse me," I said, my voice slicing clearly through the noise of the workers. "What exactly is going on in my backyard?" Miss Ruby turned to look at me, placing her hands on her hips. She did not look embarrassed or apologetic. She looked entirely entitled, staring at me as if I were a squatter on her land. "We are setting up for the baby shower, Simone. Sierra has over 200 guests coming today. Her backyard simply does not have the proper landscaping or the square footage for the photographs she wants. Terrence told us to set it up over here. He said it was fine since this is all family property anyway." I looked around at the sheer scale of the event. There were at least 20 round tables covered in expensive blue silk linens. There was a massive ornate throne chair situated right under my oak tree, clearly reserved for Sierra. The audacity was suffocating. They had literally invaded my sanctuary to celebrate the ultimate betrayal, completely confident that I would just lock myself in my bedroom and cry for the rest of the weekend. Before I could respond to Miss Ruby, the glass door slid open, and Claire came rushing out carrying a clipboard. She was wearing a brightly colored floral sundress and a huge, aggressively fake smile. "Simone, I am so glad you are awake," Claire chirped, completely ignoring the fact that she had just walked through my house without permission. "We are going to need you to clear out the main refrigerator in your kitchen right now. The caterers need the space to store the 3-tier custom cake so the buttercream does not melt. And remember what we talked about regarding sister wives energy. This is a day for healing and celebrating Terrence and his truth. We really need you to be a team player today." I looked at Claire. Then I looked at Miss Ruby. I could have easily called the police right then and there. I could have had them all escorted off my property for trespassing, flipped the catering tables, and ruined their perfect Saturday morning. But a much better, far more devastating idea had already fully formed in my mind. My private equity firm had officially completed the hostile takeover of Terrence's logistics company 48 hours ago. I legally owned his trucks, I owned his corporate bank accounts, and because he had used a dummy corporation funded by embezzled company money to buy the house next door, I now legally owned that property too. I had the official eviction notice sitting in a manila envelope on my desk, just waiting to be delivered. I gave Claire a slow, unnerving smile. "You know what, Claire? You are absolutely right," I said smoothly. "This is a day for celebrating truths. I will go clear out the refrigerator for the cake right now. You just make sure everyone is having a wonderful time," Miss Ruby scoffed, turning back to the caterers with a look of pure triumph. See, she finally learned her place. It is about time she started acting like a supportive wife. I turned around and walked back into my house. Let them set up the flowers. Let them set up the throne. Let them invite all of their friends, family, and neighborhood gossips to my backyard. They wanted a massive public spectacle. They wanted an audience to witness my humiliation and validate their cruelty. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, but I was going to rewrite the ending. I walked straight into my home office, picked up the thick manila envelope containing the eviction notice, and placed it carefully into my designer handbag. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, my backyard was completely packed. Terrence and Miss Ruby had spared no expense, or rather they had spared none of my corporate credit. A live jazz band was playing near the pool. Waiters in crisp white shirts were circulating with trays of expensive appetizers. The guests included Terrence's old fraternity brothers, Miss Ruby's entire church congregation, and a flock of Sierra's friends who kept looking at my house with envious eyes. I walked out onto the patio wearing a stunning tailored white jumpsuit. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water at the bar and watched the circus unfold. Terrence arrived a few minutes later, holding Sierra's hand as they made their grand entrance. He was smiling for the crowd, but I could see the cracks in his facade. His suit was slightly rumpled. He was sweating profusely despite the shade of the tent, and he kept checking his phone with a look of mounting panic. I knew exactly why. His personal credit cards had started declining that morning, and his bank was refusing to return his calls. He was currently functioning on pure adrenaline and absolute denial. Sierra, on the other hand, was glowing with oblivious greed. She was wearing a custom maternity gown that swept the grass, soaking up the attention as guests showered her with compliments and expensive gifts. She sat in her massive throne chair, sipping a mocktail, looking like a queen who had finally secured her castle. The jazz band paused, and the hired photographer stepped into the center of the lawn. "All right, everyone," the photographer announced loudly. "We are going to do the family portraits now. I need Terrence, Sierra, and the immediate family right over here under the floral arch." Miss Ruby practically sprinted to get into the frame, dragging Andre and Claire with her. Terrence stood proudly next to Sierra, resting his hand protectively on her stomach. They smiled perfectly for the first few shots. Then Claire stepped out of the formation and started scanning the crowd. Her eyes locked onto me, standing quietly by the bar. Simone Claire yelled, waving her arm frantically so the entire party would look in my direction. "Come on, Simone. Be the bigger person. Get in the picture. It is all about the baby today." The conversations around me died down. 200 pairs of eyes shifted to look at the discarded first wife. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for me to throw a tantrum and storm into the house, which would perfectly validate Terrence's narrative that I was unstable and bitter. I set my glass down on the bar. I picked up my handbag, tucked it neatly under my arm, and walked across the grass with my head held high. I did not glare at them. I wore a serene, unbothered smile that seemed to deeply unsettle Terrence as I approached. I stepped right under the floral arch. The photographer gestured for me to move closer. "Let us squeeze in tight," he directed. "Simone, can you step right next to Sierra?" I moved until I was standing shoulder to shoulder with my husband's pregnant mistress. Sierra smirked at me, shifting her weight so her baby bump deliberately brushed against my arm. Terrence puffed out his chest, looking incredibly smug that he had managed to force his wife and his mistress into the same photograph without shedding a drop of blood. "Say family legacy," the photographer called out, snapping the camera shutter rapidly. I stared directly into the lens, my smile never wavering. I knew this photograph would be the last moment Terrence ever experienced peace. I was standing in the middle of his perfect illusion, feeling the heavy manila envelope resting against my side. I posed for every single shot, playing the perfect accommodating host, waiting patiently for the gift opening ceremony to begin. I stood at my bedroom window, watching this absolute circus unfold on my property. My own neighbors, the people I invited to my summer barbecues and holiday dinners, were sipping champagne and offering congratulations to my husband and his pregnant mistress. Miss Ruby was working the crowd like a seasoned politician, holding Sierra by the arm and pointing proudly at her swollen belly. I did not call the police. I did not run downstairs and start flipping tables. Instead, I walked into my massive walk-in closet and pulled out a perfectly tailored bone-white designer pantsuit. If I was going to attend my own public execution, I was going to look flawless. I took my time doing my makeup, ensuring my expression was an impenetrable mask of calm confidence. Before leaving the room, I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the thick manila envelope containing the legal eviction notice. I slipped it into my clutch. When I finally stepped out onto the back patio, the Georgia heat hit me immediately, but I did not break a sweat. I walked toward the bar, ignoring the sudden hushed whispers of the guests, who noticed my arrival. 200 pairs of eyes tracked my every movement, waiting for the inevitable meltdown. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water. That is when Claire spotted me. She abandoned her conversation with one of Terrence's fraternity brothers and practically sprinted across the lawn. Simone Claire squealed, her voice artificially loud. "I am so glad you finally came down. We are about to do the family portraits by the floral arch. We need you over there right now." I looked at Claire. She was wearing a brightly colored sundress and a frantic smile. She reached out to grab my arm, but I stepped back just enough to let her hand grasp empty air. "Come on, Simone," Claire urged, her tone shifting to that patronizing fake therapy voice. You have to be the bigger person today. You need to stand next to Sierra and smile for the camera. It is all about the baby. If you refuse, it is just going to make things awkward for Terrence, and we are trying to decenter our egos. Remember? I took a slow sip of my water. Lead the way, Claire, I said smoothly. I would not want to miss the family photo. Claire looked relieved, assuming she had successfully bullied me into submission. She led me across the grass to where a massive blue and gold floral arch had been erected. Terrence was standing there looking incredibly smug in his tailored linen suit. Sierra was seated on a velvet chair next to him, fanning herself and soaking in the attention. The photographer gestured for everyone to squeeze together. Terrence wrapped one arm around his mother and the other around Sierra. Claire physically pushed me until I was standing right next to the mistress. Sierra shifted her weight deliberately, bumping her pregnant belly against my hip. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile. Thank you for letting us use your yard, Simone, Sierra whispered so only I could hear. Terrence said you would not mind since he pays the mortgage. I did not flinch. I did not correct her delusion. I just smiled directly into the camera lens. Say, family legacy, the photographer shouted. The shutter clicked. The flash blinded us for a second. I stood right in the center of their perfect illusion, feeling the weight of the manila envelope in my clutch. I knew this photograph would be the last moment Terrence ever experienced peace. All right, everyone, Terrence announced, grabbing a microphone from the DJ booth. His voice echoed across the lawn, silencing the crowd. It is time for the gift opening. If everyone could please take their seats around the main stage. The guests eagerly rushed to grab the white folding chairs arranged in a semicircle. Terrence helped Sierra up to the massive throne chair situated in the center. I took a seat in the front row, crossing my legs and resting my clutch on my lap. For the next hour, I watched as Sierra ripped wrapping paper off hundreds of expensive gifts. There were silver rattles, designer baby clothes, and pure cashmere blankets. Every time she opened a box, Miss Ruby would clap loudly and praise God for blessing their family. I sat in perfect silence, letting them enjoy their stolen joy. Finally, the pile of gifts was empty. But Terrence was not finished. He picked up the microphone again and stepped right into the center of the stage. Before we wrap this up, I have one final gift, Terrence said, his voice dripping with arrogance. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a long black velvet box. The crowd gasped in anticipation. Terrence walked over to Sierra, opened the box, and revealed a dazzling custom diamond tennis bracelet. It was easily worth $40,000. Sierra shrieked with delight. She held out her wrist, and Terrence carefully fastened the massive diamonds around her skin. He leaned into the microphone. A real man knows how to spoil the woman who gives him a legacy, he declared, looking directly at me. The crowd erupted into applause, though a few of my neighbors looked deeply uncomfortable. Sierra admired the bracelet, holding her wrist up to catch the sunlight. Then she looked down at me sitting in the front row. Her greed and her sudden rise in status had made her incredibly bold. She believed she was untouchable. It is so beautiful, Sierra said into the microphone, her voice carrying across my entire backyard. Terrence told me you always had to buy your own jewelry, Simone. Poor thing. I guess a man only spoils the woman who actually gives him a future. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the yard. The band stopped playing. The waiters stopped pouring drinks. Every single person turned to look at me. They expected me to run away crying. They expected me to crumble under the sheer weight of the public humiliation. Terrence stood next to her, grinning, waiting for his victory lap. I slowly uncrossed my legs. I stood up from my folding chair, smoothed the front of my white pantsuit, and calmly walked up the short steps to the stage. I did not look angry. I did not look broken. I walked right up to Sierra, gently pushed Terrence aside, and took the microphone directly from his hand. I smiled brightly at the crowd of 200 people. The silence was absolute. You could hear the wind rustling the leaves of my oak tree. I did not want to show up to the celebration empty-handed, I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive speakers. I actually brought a gift for the new house. I opened my clutch, pulled out the thick manila envelope, and handed it directly to Sierra. She snatched it eagerly. She clearly expected a massive check, assuming I had finally buckled under the pressure, and decided to pay my way into their good graces to avoid further embarrassment. Sierra ripped the envelope open. She pulled out the heavy legal documents and began to read. I watched her face as the reality of her situation hit her. The smug, triumphant smile vanished instantly. Her jaw dropped. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the expensive diamond bracelet rattled against her wrist. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking physically sick. She was not looking at a check. She was looking at a legally binding court-ordered eviction notice demanding she vacate the $5 million property next door within 48 hours. Terrence frowned, noticing the sheer panic radiating from his mistress. "What is it, baby?" he asked, reaching for the paper. "What did she give you?" I stood there in my flawless white suit, holding the microphone completely unbothered. The dominoes were finally falling, and I was about to crush his entire world in front of everyone he knew. Terrence reached over and snatched the thick stack of papers right out of Sierra's trembling hands. He scanned the first page, his brow furrowing in confusion. Then his eyes jumped to the bold legal header at the top of the document. The confusion melted into a deep, explosive rage. His face turned a dark shade of crimson, and the veins in his neck bulged against his crisp linen collar. "What is this, Simone?" Terrence bellowed, his voice raw and furious. "You think you can hand my family a fake eviction notice? Are you out of your mind? I bought that house. I own that property." I raised the microphone back to my lips. I wanted every single one of the 200 guests sitting in my backyard to hear the exact mechanics of his downfall. "No, Terrence," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the manicured lawn. "You do not own the house. Your logistics company bought that property using a dummy limited liability company, the exact same logistics company that you have been secretly bleeding dry for the past year. You embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars in operational funds to buy designer bags, imported marble and diamond bracelets for your side piece." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. I saw his fraternity brothers exchanging shocked glances. I saw Miss Ruby drop her fan, her mouth hanging open. Sierra clutched her pregnant belly, looking frantically between Terrence and the crowd, realizing her billionaire baby daddy was suddenly sounding very much like a criminal. Terrence stepped closer to me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into silence. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "I am the chief executive officer," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "I own the logistics company. It is my name on the door. You cannot evict me from a house my own company purchased. I will sue you for everything you have." I let out a short, cold laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who had just checkmated a very foolish king. "You have not owned that company since the day you marched into my office and demanded I guarantee your $2 million commercial loan," I explained smoothly. "You were so eager to get my signature that you did not bother to read the fine print. The bank you used is heavily leveraged by my private equity firm. When you inevitably defaulted on your payments last week, my firm called in the debt. We initiated a hostile takeover. I fully acquired your entire corporate portfolio 48 hours ago." Terrence stopped breathing. His arm dropped slowly to his side. The arrogant, untouchable facade shattered completely, leaving behind a terrified, broken man. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. "I own your commercial fleet, Terrence," I stated clearly. "I own your corporate bank accounts. I own the dummy corporation you used to hide your embezzlement. And because I own that corporation, I hold the absolute legal deed to the $5 million estate next door. You are nothing but a squatter living on my property." Total chaos erupted around the stage. Miss Ruby started wailing loudly, clutching her chest and dramatically swaying as if she were about to faint. She looked desperately at the crowd for sympathy, but the church congregation was too busy whispering in shock to run to her aid. The golden child was officially a fraud. Then Claire decided to step forward. She pushed her way past the front row of folding chairs and marched up the stairs to the stage. She was practically vibrating with nervous energy, desperate to regain control of the narrative and play the family savior. "Simone, you need to stop this right now," Claire commanded, trying to use her authoritative therapy voice. "You cannot just steal a family business. Legally speaking, there are protections against this kind of malicious marital interference. You are acting out of trauma, and we are going to hire a lawyer to reverse all of this." I turned my head and looked at my white sister-in-law. The sheer audacity she possessed to climb onto my stage and lecture me about the law was almost impressive, but I had a bullet chambered specifically for her. "Shut up, Claire," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy tone that immediately silenced her. "Your husband Andre owes my firm $300,000 in defaulted bridge loans. He took that money 2 years ago to cover his gambling debts, and he used your primary residence as collateral." Claire went completely pale. The fake patronizing smile vanished from her face. She slowly turned her head to look at Andre, who was currently hiding in the second row, staring at his shoes in absolute terror. "So unless you want your family living in a cheap motel by Tuesday afternoon, I suggest you take your sister wives' book, pack up your organic cupcakes, and sit back down," I commanded. Claire did not say another word. She practically scrambled off the stage, her face burning with humiliation as the neighborhood gossips immediately turned their attention to her crumbling marriage. I turned my attention back to Terrence and Sierra. Sierra was sobbing hysterically, pulling at her diamond tennis bracelet as if it were suddenly burning her skin. She realized that the luxury life she thought she had secured was built entirely on a foundation of sand, and the tide had just rushed in. "You have 48 hours to get your imported Italian cribs and your mistress off my property," I told Terrence, making sure the microphone picked up every single word. "If you are not completely moved out by Monday morning, I am calling the sheriff to execute the eviction, and then I am bulldozing that house to build myself a custom tennis court." I did not wait for his response. I signaled to the head caterer standing frozen near the bar. "The party is officially over," I announced to the crowd. "You do not have to go home, but you have to get off my lawn." I handed the microphone back to the disc jockey. I picked up my designer clutch, smoothed the front of my white pantsuit, and walked gracefully down the stairs of the stage. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. Nobody said a word. Nobody dared to look me in the eye. I walked across the manicured grass, stepped through my glass patio doors, and locked them behind me. The fallout outside was immediate and loud. I could hear Sierra screaming at Terrence, accusing him of lying to her about his wealth. I could hear Miss Ruby crying, begging the remaining guests not to judge her family. But inside my house, it was perfectly quiet. I walked into the kitchen, poured the rest of my sparkling water into the sink, and smiled. I had taken his pride, his company, and his house. But I still had one final blow left to deliver, and it was going to be the one that ensured he never recovered. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over my meticulously landscaped backyard. The hired jazz band had completely stopped playing. The catering staff froze with silver trays of appetizers balanced in their hands. 200 guests held their collective breath, waiting for the discarded barren wife to finally break. They expected me to burst into tears. They expected me to turn around, run into my house, and pack my bags in absolute defeat. Terrence stood next to Sierra, his chest puffed out in his expensive linen suit. He wore a sickeningly triumphant smile, soaking in the public humiliation he had just subjected me to. Miss Ruby was nodding in approval from the front row, fanning herself lazily. I did not cry. I did not scream. I slowly uncrossed my legs, smoothed the front of my white designer pantsuit, and stood up from my folding chair. The sheer confidence in my posture seemed to send a ripple of unease through the front row. I walked deliberately up the short set of wooden stairs to the main stage. My heels clicked rhythmically against the floorboards, a slow and steady countdown to their total destruction. I walked right up to Sierra, who was still holding her wrist up to admire the $40,000 diamonds. I gently but firmly pushed Terence aside. He frowned, stepping back instinctively, because he had never seen me look so completely devoid of empathy. I reached out and took the microphone directly from his hand. I turned to face the crowd of 200 people. The silence was absolute. You could hear the wind rustling the leaves of my ancient oak tree. Sierra makes an excellent point, I said, my voice echoing clearly and calmly through the massive speakers. A man should absolutely spoil the woman who secures his future. And I did not want to show up to such a monumental celebration empty-handed. I actually brought a gift of my own. A housewarming gift for the new family. I opened my sleek designer clutch and pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope. I turned back to Sierra and handed it directly to her. Sierra snatched it eagerly. The smugness returned to her face in an instant. She clearly expected a massive cashier check. She assumed I had finally buckled under the psychological pressure and decided to pay my way into their good graces to avoid any further embarrassment. She thought I was buying her silence. Sierra ripped the top of the envelope open and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. She did not look at the fine print first. Her eyes immediately darted to the bold capitalized header printed across the very top page. I watched her face as the reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. The triumphant smile vanished. Her jaw went slack. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the heavy diamond bracelet rattled against her wrist. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking physically sick. She was not looking at a financial settlement. She was looking at a legally binding court-ordered eviction notice demanding she vacate the $5 million property next door within exactly 48 hours. Terence noticed the sheer panic radiating from his mistress. He dropped his confident posture and stepped closer to her. "What is it, baby?" he asked, his voice laced with sudden concern. "What did she give you? Is it a check?" Sierra could not speak. She simply handed the thick stack of papers to Terence, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Terence grabbed the documents. He scanned the first page, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Then his eyes locked onto the legal header. The confusion melted into a blind, explosive rage. His face turned a dark, dangerous shade of crimson, and the veins in his neck bulged against his collar. "What is this?" Simone Terence bellowed. He was so angry he forgot I was still holding the microphone. His voice was raw and furious, carrying across the silent yard. "You think you can hand my family a fake eviction notice? Are you completely out of your mind? I bought that house. I own that property. You have absolutely no legal right to serve us with this garbage." I raised the microphone back to my lips. I wanted every single one of the 200 guests sitting in my backyard to hear the exact mechanics of his downfall. I wanted Miss Ruby to hear it. I wanted Claire to hear it. "No, Terence," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously polite. "You do not own that house. Your logistics company bought that property using a dummy limited liability company, the exact same logistics company that you have been secretly bleeding dry for the past year. You embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars in operational funds to buy designer bags, imported marble, and diamond bracelets for your side piece." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. I saw his old fraternity brothers exchanging shocked, wide-eyed glances. I saw Miss Ruby drop her fan onto the grass, her mouth hanging open in absolute horror. Sierra clutched her pregnant belly, looking frantically between Terence and the whispering crowd, suddenly realizing her billionaire baby daddy was sounding very much like a desperate criminal. Terence took a threatening step toward me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into silence. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "I am the chief executive officer," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "I own the logistics company. It is my name on the building. You cannot evict me from a house my own company purchased. I will sue you for everything you have. I will ruin your private equity firm." I let out a short, cold laugh. It was the sound of a wealth manager who had just liquidated a terrible asset. You have not owned that company since the day you marched into my home office and demanded I guarantee your $2 million commercial loan, I explained, making sure my diction was crystal clear for the audience. You were so eager to trap me with that signature that you did not bother to read the fine print. The bank you used is heavily leveraged by my private equity firm. When you inevitably defaulted on your payments last week, my firm called in the debt. We initiated a hostile takeover. I fully acquired your entire corporate portfolio 48 hours ago. Terrence stopped breathing. His raised arm dropped slowly to his side. The arrogant, untouchable facade shattered completely into a million pieces, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, financially ruined man. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us until I was looking directly into his panicked eyes. I own your commercial fleet, Terrence, I stated clearly. I own your corporate bank accounts. I own the dummy corporation you used to hide your embezzlement. And because I own that corporation, I hold the absolute legal deed to the $5 million estate next door. You are nothing but a squatter living on my property, and you have exactly 48 hours to get off my land. Sierra stared at the eviction notice, her hands shaking so violently that the heavy paper crinkled loudly in the dead silence of the backyard. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter confusion. Terrence saw her face drop and immediately snatched the document from her fingers. He read the bold print at the top of the page. Notice to vacate. His face flushed with a sudden violent heat. He tried to laugh. It was a strained, desperate sound that echoed awkwardly across the manicured lawn. This is a very sick joke, Simone, he announced to the crowd, waving the paper in the air. You cannot evict me from a house that I own. I am the chief executive officer of my own company. My company bought that property. I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. I leaned into the microphone so every single person in the backyard could hear the precise details of his financial ruin. Your company did buy that property, Terrence, I said calmly. You used a dummy limited liability company to purchase it, funding the account with hundreds of thousands of dollars you embezzled from your own operational budget over the last year. The crowd gasped. You could hear the ice clinking in the glasses of the paralyzed waiters. You were so desperate for cash to cover up your theft that you forced me to sign as a guarantor on a $2 million commercial loan, I continued, my voice steady and commanding. But you were too arrogant to read the fine print. The lending institution you used is heavily leveraged by my private equity firm. When you defaulted on your bridge loans last week, my firm called in the debt. We initiated a hostile takeover. I fully acquired your entire corporate portfolio 48 hours ago. Terrence froze. The paper slipped from his fingers and fluttered onto the grass. I own your commercial fleet, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute finality. I own your corporate bank accounts. I own the dummy corporation you used to hide your embezzlement. And because I own that corporation, I hold the absolute legal deed to the $5 million estate next door. You are nothing but a squatter living on my property, and you have exactly 48 hours to get off my land. Chaos erupted. Miss Ruby let out a loud theatrical wail and collapsed into a folding chair. The church ladies began whispering furiously, gathering their purses and rushing toward the side gate. Terrence and his old fraternity brothers suddenly looked deeply fascinated by their shoes, slowly backing away from the stage to avoid being associated with him. Sierra burst into hysterical tears. She grabbed Terrence by the arm, shaking him. "Tell me, she is lying," Sierra screamed, her voice cracking. "Tell me you own the house, Terrence. Tell me you have the money." Terrence could not look at her. He could not look at me. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his destruction. I signaled to the catering manager standing near the patio. "The party is officially over," I announced. "Please begin packing up your equipment, and take the custom cake with you." I handed the microphone back to the stunned disc jockey. I picked up my designer clutch, smoothed my white pantsuit, and walked down the steps of the stage. The crowd parted for me immediately. Nobody dared to speak a word to me. I walked across the lawn, stepped into my house, and closed the heavy glass doors behind me. The sound of the panicked crowd was instantly muffled. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a fresh glass of sparkling water. A few seconds later, the back door flew open and slammed against the wall. Terence stormed into the kitchen. He was breathing heavily. His linen suit wrinkled, his eyes wild like a cornered animal. "You think you have won?" Terence yelled, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You think you can just steal my company and humiliate my mother in front of the entire neighborhood? I will destroy you for this, Simone. I will drag you through the mud in divorce court." I leaned against the marble counter and took a sip of my water. "Go ahead, Terence," I said softly. "We live in an equitable distribution state," he threatened, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am filing for divorce tomorrow morning. I am going to demand half of your private equity firm. I am going to take half of this house. I will demand permanent spousal support. You make 10 times what I make. I will make you pay me alimony for the rest of your miserable barren life. I will take everything you have built, and I will give it to my son." He was banking on the legal system to save him. He truly believed that a judge would look at our 5-year marriage and grant him a massive payout simply because my net worth was vastly superior to his. He thought he had a golden parachute. I calmly reached into my designer handbag. I pulled out a second manila envelope slightly thinner than the first one. I slid it across the marble kitchen island. It stopped right in front of him. "I am always one step ahead of you, Terence," I said. "Open it." He grabbed the envelope and ripped it open. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. "I already had my attorney draft the divorce papers," I explained. "I thought it would save you the legal fees since you currently do not have a dollar to your name." Flip to the very last page. Terence flipped frantically through the thick stack of paper. He reached the final page. It was a notarized document featuring both of our signatures and a bright blue legal seal. "Read the third paragraph out loud," I instructed him. Terence stared at the paper. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His hands began to shake all over again. "It is a post-nuptial agreement," I said, filling the silence for him. "You signed it 5 years ago. I buried it under a massive stack of tax documents, and you were too lazy to read anything I put in front of you. You just wanted to get to the golf course, so you signed wherever I placed the sticky notes." Terence looked up at me, his eyes filled with pure horror. "That specific clause states that in the event of infidelity resulting in a child conceived outside of our marriage, you forfeit all rights to marital assets," I recited perfectly from memory. "You forfeit any claim to my private equity firm. You forfeit all rights to this primary residence. And you permanently waive your right to seek spousal support or alimony." I took another slow sip of my water. "You leave this marriage with exactly what you brought into it, Terence. Absolutely nothing." Just then, the back door opened again. Sierra waddled into the kitchen, her face streaked with heavy mascara. She had heard everything through the open window. She looked at Terence, realizing that her wealthy, powerful baby daddy was completely broke, homeless, and legally barred from ever touching my money. "You lied to me!" Sierra screamed, unclasping her $40,000 diamond bracelet and throwing it directly at his chest. "You told me you were rich. You told me she meant nothing. You are a broke loser." Terence tried to reach for her, stammering out panicked apologies, but she pushed him away and stormed back out the door, yelling that she was calling her mother to come pick her up. Through the glass, I could see Miss Ruby still crying on the lawn, completely abandoned by the remaining guests. Terence stood alone in my kitchen, holding the divorce papers that officially sealed his ruin. He had nothing left to say. He had no threats left to make. I set my glass down on the counter. "I suggest you go help your mother off my grass, Terence," I said softly, "and do not forget to pack your bags." I turned my back on him and walked out of the kitchen. I climbed the sweeping staircase to the second floor, walked into my master bedroom, and locked the door. I walked over to the window and watched as Terence slowly trudged across the lawn to console his weeping mother. They told me to serve her or leave. I decided to serve them both right into bankruptcy. The weekend passed in a satisfying symphony of chaos. From my master bedroom window, I watched the immediate fallout of the baby shower. Sierra's mother arrived in a beat-up sedan just before midnight, screaming at Terrence from the driveway, while Sierra dragged her designer suitcases across the grass. Miss Ruby locked herself in the guest house, entirely too embarrassed to show her face to the neighbors. Terrence spent Sunday frantically pacing his front porch, aggressively dialing his corporate attorneys, leaving voicemails that I knew would never be returned. He actually believed the backyard baby shower was the climax of his humiliation. He thought my dramatic presentation of the eviction notice and the divorce papers was the absolute worst thing that could happen to him. He was entirely mistaken. Saturday was merely his personal execution. Monday morning was reserved for his professional slaughter. I did not stay home to watch the county sheriff arrive at 8 o'clock to physically change the locks on the $5 million house next door. I had far more important business to attend to. By 7 in the morning, I was dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal gray power suit. I drove downtown to the headquarters of Terrence's logistics company. It was a sleek, modern glass building that he loved to brag about at dinner parties. When I walked through the sliding glass doors, my lead corporate attorney, David, was already waiting in the lobby with a team of 6 forensic accountants and 2 armed private security contractors. We bypassed the panicked receptionist and took the private elevator straight to the executive floor. By the time the senior staff began arriving for their morning coffee, my team had already commandeered the main boardroom. I took my seat at the absolute head of the long mahogany table, exactly where Terrence usually sat to stroke his own ego. I instructed the executive assistants to summon the entire board of directors and all department heads for an emergency mandatory meeting. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy double doors of the boardroom flew open. Terrence marched in. He looked completely unhinged. He was wearing the same wrinkled linen trousers from the baby shower. His eyes were bloodshot, and he was gripping his leather briefcase so tightly his knuckles were white. He had clearly spent the entire weekend desperately trying to rally a defense, completely convinced that his status as the founder and chief executive officer gave him untouchable immunity. "What in the hell is going on here?" Terrence barked, stopping dead in his tracks when he saw me sitting in his chair. He looked around at his board members, who were all staring at him with expressions of absolute disgust. "Call security immediately. Get this woman out of my building. She is having a mental breakdown." None of the executives moved. The private security contractors flanking the door simply crossed their arms. "This is no longer your building, Terrence," I said, my voice projecting effortlessly across the silent room. "You might want to take a seat. We were just reviewing the quarterly expenditure reports. They are quite fascinating." Terrence slammed his briefcase onto the nearest table. "I am not sitting down. I am the majority shareholder of this corporation. I own this company. You think you can hand me some fake papers at a party and steal my life? I have already drafted a legal injunction. You are going to prison for corporate espionage, Simone." I did not even blink. I picked up a thick-bound dossier from the table and slid it down the polished mahogany wood. It stopped right at the edge of the table, perfectly within his reach. "You should really start reading the documents placed in front of you, Terrence," I advised smoothly. "Because if you had bothered to check your own accounting software over the last 8 months, you would know that you do not have a leg to stand on." I stood up, resting my hands flat on the table, and addressed the horrified board of directors. "Your former chief executive officer has been lying to you," I announced. Over the past year, Terrence secretly established a phantom limited liability company. It was a dummy corporation completely hidden off the primary books. He used this shell company to systematically embezzle over $800,000 directly from your operational budget. Terrence went completely pale. The bluster instantly drained from his posture. He opened his mouth to object, but his throat seemed to seize up. "He did not use that money for business expansion." I continued walking slowly down the length of the table. "He used your fleet maintenance funds to put a down payment on a $5 million luxury estate for his 26-year-old mistress. He used your employee payroll reserves to buy her $40,000 diamond bracelets, imported Italian marble, and organic groceries. He bled this logistics company dry to play the role of a billionaire sugar daddy, leaving all of you on the brink of total insolvency." The chief financial officer, a stern older man named Robert, took off his glasses and rubbed his temples. "We are facing federal fraud charges," Robert whispered, his voice shaking with anger. "You used company assets to buy real estate for your side piece. You absolute fool, you have ruined us all." Terrence tried to puff out his chest, desperately clinging to his alpha male persona. He pointed a shaking finger at Robert. "Do not speak to me like that. I built this company from the ground up. I am the boss. I will fire every single one of you. I will liquidate the assets myself to cover the deficit. You cannot evict me from my own empire." I let out a short, cold laugh. It was a hard, unforgiving sound that echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. "You cannot fire anyone, Terrence," I said softly, stopping right next to him. "And you certainly cannot liquidate assets that you no longer possess." I gestured to David, who opened his briefcase and pulled out the finalized acquisition contracts. "You have not owned a single share of this company since the afternoon you marched into my home office and demanded I guarantee your $2 million commercial loan," I explained, looking him dead in the eye. "You were so desperate to cover up your massive embezzlement that you tried to financially trap me. But you did not read the fine print." Terrence stared at me, his breathing becoming shallow and frantic as the final pieces of the puzzle locked into place in his mind. "The private equity firm that bought your debt is my firm," I stated with absolute clarity. "When you defaulted on your bridge loans last Thursday, it triggered an automatic forfeiture clause. My firm executed a hostile takeover. We legally acquired your entire corporate portfolio. I own your commercial trucks. I own your corporate bank accounts. I own the dummy limited liability company you used to hide your stolen money. And because I own that shell company, I own the massive house you bought for your mistress." The boardroom was dead silent. The executives were staring at me with a mixture of profound shock and deep respect. I had not just saved their company from bankruptcy, I had surgically removed the cancer that was destroying it. "You have nothing, Terrence," I whispered, standing close enough to smell the stale alcohol radiating from his pores. "You are entirely stripped of your title, your equity, and your access to this building. In fact, the only thing you do have is a choice." Terrence looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant. "A choice?" He mumbled, his voice completely broken. "Yes," I replied cheerfully. "You can either sign the divorce papers exactly as they are written, walking away quietly with zero alimony and zero assets. Or I can hand this entire dossier of your embezzlement records over to the federal authorities today, and you can spend the next 10 years in a minimum security prison for corporate fraud. The choice is entirely yours." Terrence looked around the room. He looked at the faces of his former colleagues, men and women who used to hang on his every word, now looking at him like he was a stain on the carpet. He looked at the towering stack of evidence proving his theft. He had absolutely nowhere left to run. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a pen, and signed the final page of the divorce agreement without saying a single word. He pushed the paper across the table toward me. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely let go of the pen. I picked up the document, verified his signature, and handed it to my attorney. "Thank you for your cooperation, Terrence," I said, turning my back on him and walking to the head of the table. "Gentlemen, please escort our former guest out of the building." The two private security contractors stepped forward, grabbing Terrence firmly by both arms. He did not fight them. He did not scream or make any more empty threats. The fight was completely drained out of him. He let them guide him out of the boardroom, a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had parked a moving truck in my driveway just 1 month ago. I took my seat at the head of the mahogany table, smoothed the lapels of my charcoal suit, and looked at my new board of directors. "Now then," I said with a warm professional smile, "let us get to work. We have a logistics empire to rebuild." The absolute silence that followed my announcement did not last long. The reality of Terrence losing his entire corporate empire in the house next door hit the crowd of 200 guests like a shockwave. Total chaos broke out across my manicured lawn. The jazz band abruptly stopped playing, the musicians lowering their instruments to watch the drama unfold. The neighborhood gossips began whispering so loudly it sounded like a swarm of bees. Miss Ruby was the first to completely lose her composure. Her golden child, the son she had paraded around as a billionaire logistics mogul, had just been exposed as an embezzler and a fraud. She let out a loud theatrical wail that echoed across the yard. She grabbed her chest, clutching her pearls, and staggered backward into a row of white folding chairs. She threw her head back, screaming to the heavens that I was the devil. She wailed that I was a wicked, barren woman sent to destroy her perfect family. A few of her church friends rushed over to fan her with their programs, but I noticed several others quietly stepping away, eager to distance themselves from the sudden stench of financial ruin and public scandal. Then Claire decided it was her moment to shine. Andre's white wife, who consumed self-help books like water and firmly believed she was the moral compass of our family, pushed her way to the front of the crowd. She smoothed down her floral sundress, adjusted her posture, and tried to summon every ounce of fake authority she possessed. "Simone, you need to stop this right now," Claire commanded, using her soft, patronizing therapy voice as she marched up to the stage. "You cannot just steal a family business. Legally speaking, there are protections against this kind of malicious marital interference. You are acting out of trauma and a bruised ego. We are going to hire a lawyer to reverse all of this, and you are going to end up paying for the emotional damage you are causing to Terrence and Sierra today." I looked at Claire. The sheer audacity she possessed to stand in my backyard eating food I paid for and lecture me about corporate law was genuinely astounding. I did not raise my voice, but I cut her off so fast it gave her whiplash. "Shut up, Claire," I said. The icy tone of my voice instantly killed her fake therapist persona. Claire gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. The crowd grew dead quiet again, eager to hear the next piece of family tea. "Do not stand on my property and talk to me about what is legal." I continued, looking right through her. "Because if you want to talk about the law, we can talk about the fact that your husband, Andre, owes my private equity firm $300,000 in defaulted bridge loans. He took that money 2 years ago to cover his massive gambling debts, and he quietly used your primary residence as collateral without telling you." Claire went completely pale. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a ghost. Her jaw dropped, and the confident, patronizing smile vanished forever. She slowly turned her head to look into the crowd. Andre was standing near the buffet tables. He was sweating profusely, his face buried in his hands. He looked like he was going to vomit right into the manicured grass. "So, unless you want your family living in a cheap roadside motel by Tuesday afternoon, I suggest you take your sister wives' book, pack up your organic cupcakes, and sit down," I ordered. Claire did not say another word. She shrank away, practically tripping over her own sandals as she scrambled off the stage and ran toward Andre. The neighborhood gossips immediately pivoted their attention, pointing and whispering about Andre's secret gambling addiction. The entire toxic family structure was collapsing in real time, exposing all the rot they had desperately tried to hide behind their fake smiles and designer clothes. I turned my back on the in-laws and focused my attention on the two people who truly deserved my wrath. Terrence and Sierra were standing together, but the physical distance between them felt like a mile. The power dynamic had completely inverted. Terrence was no longer the arrogant, untouchable chief executive officer. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his wrinkled linen suit. He was completely broken, staring at the grass as if he expected it to swallow him whole. Sierra was sobbing uncontrollably. The smug, entitled mistress who had demanded organic meals and imported Italian marble was gone. She was clutching her baby bump, shaking from head to toe, realizing that the luxury life she thought she had secured was a complete mirage. Her rich baby daddy was broke, and the woman she had openly mocked was the one holding all the keys. "You have exactly 48 hours to get your imported cribs and your baby mama off my property," I told Terrence, making sure the microphone picked up every single syllable. You have until Monday morning to vacate the premises completely. If there is so much as a designer baby blanket left in that house by noon, I am calling the county sheriff to execute a forced eviction. Terrence slowly looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and filled with genuine terror. But where are we supposed to go? He stammered, his voice cracking. I do not have any liquid cash, Simone. My credit cards are declining. That sounds like a personal problem, I replied coldly. Perhaps Miss Ruby can clear out her guest room for the new family legacy. But you will not be staying next door. Because once you are out, I am bulldozing that $5 million house to build myself a custom tennis court. I always wanted to work on my backhand. Sierra let out a fresh wail of despair. She looked at Terrence with pure disgust, realizing he had absolutely no plan and no money to save them. I was done talking. I lowered the microphone and handed it back to the stunned disc jockey. I turned to look at the massive catering crew standing frozen near the bar. The entire party had been funded by the corporate credit card tied to Terrence's now defunct business account, which meant my firm was technically footing the bill. I caught the eye of the head catering manager. The party is officially over, I announced clearly. Start packing up the food immediately. Do not leave a single appetizer on those tables, and take the custom 3-tier cake with you. Distribute it to your staff or throw it in the trash, I do not care. But nobody takes another bite on my dime. The catering manager nodded quickly, terrified of getting on my bad side. He clapped his hands, and his team immediately sprang into action. Right in the middle of the lavish baby shower, the waiters began pulling plates of expensive food away from the guests. They started dumping the silver chafing dishes into plastic containers. The bartender began boxing up the top-shelf liquor. The guests did not wait to be formally dismissed. The sheer embarrassment of the situation was too much for the neighborhood to handle. People began quickly grabbing their purses and making a straight line for the front gate. Nobody said goodbye to Terrence. Nobody offered to help Sierra carry her massive pile of expensive baby gifts. They just wanted to escape the blast radius of the absolute destruction I had just unleashed. I stood on the patio and watched them all scatter. I watched Claire dragging a highly distressed Andre toward their car, arguing loudly about the house they were about to lose. I watched the church ladies practically carrying a weeping Miss Ruby down the driveway. And I watched Terrence and Sierra standing alone in the middle of my backyard, surrounded by empty tables and dismantled floral arrangements trapped in the ruins of the fake empire they had tried to build on my back. I let him pace. I let him scream until his vocal cords were raw, watching him knock over a crystal vase that shattered across my imported hardwood floors. He was sweating profusely, his expensive linen suit completely ruined by the Georgia humidity and his own sheer panic. He was aggressively waving his hands in the air, shouting about retaining the best divorce lawyers in Atlanta, about how the state laws would force me to liquidate my assets and hand him half of everything I had spent my entire adult life building. He truly believed he possessed a golden parachute. He thought the legal system was designed to protect mediocre men who used their wives as stepping stones. I leaned casually against the cool marble of my kitchen island. I did not interrupt his tantrum. A seasoned wealth manager knows that you always let a collapsing asset completely exhaust its momentum before you close the account. When Terrence finally stopped to catch his breath, leaning heavily against the stainless steel refrigerator, I reached into my designer handbag. I pulled out a second manila envelope. It was slightly thinner than the eviction notice I had handed his mistress on the stage. I placed it flat on the marble counter and slid it smoothly across the surface. It stopped right at the edge, inches from his trembling hands. I am always one step ahead of you, Terrence, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. You do not need to call your lawyers in the morning. I already had my legal team draft the divorce papers. I thought it would save you the massive retainer fee, considering you currently do not have a single dollar to your name. Terrence glared at me, his chest heaving. He snatched the envelope off the counter and ripped it open, pulling out the thick stack of legal documents. He scoffed loudly, clearly thinking he could just drag the proceedings out in court and drain my resources. Flip to the very last page, I instructed him. He rolled his eyes but complied, flipping aggressively through the heavy paper, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon until he reached the back. He stopped. He stared at the page. I watched his eyes lock onto a highly specific notarized document featuring both of our signatures and a bright blue legal seal of the state. "Read the third paragraph out loud," I said. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The last remaining drops of blood drained completely from his face. His hands began to tremble so violently that the thick paper shook in his grip. "It is a postnuptial agreement," I said, filling the dead silence for him. "You signed it 5 years ago. Do you remember that Tuesday morning right before your annual golf trip to Florida? You were in such a frantic rush to get to the airport. I handed you a massive stack of what I called routine tax documents and corporate liability waivers. You were entirely too lazy to read a single word. You just wanted to make your tea time, so you blindly signed wherever I placed a yellow sticky note." Terrence slowly looked up at me. His eyes were wide, filled with absolute paralyzing horror. "That specific clause," I continued, reciting the text perfectly from memory, "states that in the event of documented infidelity resulting in a child conceived outside of our marriage, you forfeit all rights to marital assets. You forfeit any claim to my private equity firm. You forfeit all rights, titles, and interests in this primary residence. And you permanently waive your right to ever seek spousal support or alimony of any kind." He dropped the papers onto the kitchen island. He looked like a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. "You leave this marriage with exactly what you brought into it, Terrence," I said softly. "Absolutely nothing." Before he could even attempt to formulate a pathetic response, the back door swung open. Sierra stepped into the kitchen. Her face was streaked with ruined mascara, and she was breathing heavily. She had been standing on the patio, listening to every single word through the open glass doors. She looked at Terrence. The illusion of the wealthy, powerful patriarch was completely shattered in her eyes. She realized that her billionaire baby daddy was a broke, homeless fraud who was legally barred from ever touching a single dime of my wealth. "You lied to me," Sierra screamed. Her voice was shrill and piercing, echoing off the high ceilings. She reached for her wrist, violently unclasping the $40,000 diamond tennis bracelet he had just given her. She threw it directly at his chest. The heavy jewelry hit him hard and clattered onto the floor. "You told me you were rich. You told me she was just a stepping stone. You are a broke, pathetic loser." Terrence tried to reach for her, stammering out panicked apologies and begging her to just wait and let him figure out a new business plan. But Sierra pushed his hands away in pure disgust. She turned around and stormed right back out the door, yelling into her cell phone, demanding her mother come pick her up immediately. Through the massive glass windows, I could see Miss Ruby still sitting on a folding chair in the middle of the ruined yard. She was weeping loudly, fanning herself, completely abandoned by her church friends and her golden child. Claire and Andre had long since fled the scene in their SUV, rushing home to try and salvage the house Andre had secretly gambled away. Terrence stood completely alone in my beautiful kitchen. He looked down at the diamond bracelet sparkling on the hardwood floor, then at the divorce papers resting on the counter. He had nothing left to say. He had no more threats to make. The legal system he was banking on had been the exact weapon I used to destroy his entire existence. I walked over to the counter and picked up my half-finished iced matcha latte. I took a slow, refreshing sip. The drink was perfectly sweet. "I suggest you go help your mother off my grass, Terrence," I said, my voice calm, steady, and completely at peace. "And do not forget to pack your bags. The clock on your 48-hour eviction notice is already ticking." I turned my back on him for the final time. I walked out of the kitchen, my heels clicking softly and rhythmically against the floor. I climbed the grand sweeping staircase to the second floor, walked into my master bedroom, and locked the heavy oak door behind me. I walked over to the large bay window and looked out over my property. The catering crew was rapidly taking down the massive white tent. Terrence was slowly trudging across the lawn, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, a broken man walking toward a weeping woman. Both of them were entirely removed from my future. They told me to serve her or leave. I decided to serve them both, right into bankruptcy. The rest of the weekend was a symphony of perfect silence inside my home. I did not answer the frantic pounding on my locked bedroom door. I did not respond to the pathetic sliding of handwritten apology notes underneath the heavy oak doorframe. I simply turned on my surround sound system, poured myself a glass of expensive red wine, and reviewed the final transition documents for my newly acquired logistics empire. Through my reinforced glass windows, I watched the tragic comedy playing out on my front lawn. Sierra did not even stay the night. Her mother pulled up in a dented sedan just before midnight. Sierra dragged her designer suitcases across the grass, screaming at Terrence that he had ruined her life before slamming the car door and speeding off into the darkness. Miss Ruby had to call a rideshare service to get back to her house because Terrence no longer had access to his corporate luxury vehicles and his personal cards were declining. Terrence spent the night sleeping in the front seat of his personal sedan, staring blankly at the steering wheel of a car he would not be able to afford next month. Monday morning arrived with the crisp promise of total justice. Exactly 48 hours after I handed Sierra that manila envelope, I stood on my front porch, wearing a silk robe and holding a fresh cup of matcha. At precisely 8 o'clock, two white county sheriff vehicles pulled into the driveway of the estate next door. Terrence practically fell out of his car when the deputies approached the front door. I watched as he desperately tried to plead his case, waving his hands and pointing frantically at the house. He tried to explain that there had been a massive legal misunderstanding, that he was the chief executive officer of the company that owned the property. The deputies simply handed him the court order my legal team had finalized on Friday. They gave him exactly 15 minutes to gather any remaining personal items before they officially changed the locks and padlocked the wrought iron gates. He walked out carrying two black trash bags full of wrinkled clothes and a single cardboard box of paperwork. He stopped at the edge of the driveway and looked over at me standing on my porch. He looked entirely broken. The arrogant man who had demanded I make a welcome basket for his mistress was now standing on the curb with his entire life stuffed into garbage bags. I raised my ceramic mug in a silent toast, turned around, and went back inside to get dressed for work. The corporate takeover was even more seamless than the residential eviction. When I arrived at the logistics company headquarters that morning, my team of forensic accountants had already secured the building. I did not just take over Terrence's massive corner office. I had it completely gutted, sterilized, and redesigned by Wednesday. The full audit revealed exactly how deeply he had compromised the company finances to fund his double life. He had forged invoices, manipulated payroll, and stolen directly from his hardworking employees to buy imported Italian marble for a woman he barely knew. Because I held an absolute mountain of undeniable evidence proving his massive embezzlement, Terrence had no choice but to sit in my lawyer's office and sign the finalized divorce decree without contesting a single clause. He sat across the long conference table looking at the floor, his hands shaking as he initialed the pages. If he had tried to fight me in court, I would have handed the audit directly to federal prosecutors. He traded his right to alimony and equitable distribution for his freedom from a 10-year sentence in a federal prison cell. He walked out of that office with nothing but the clothes on his back. The fallout across the rest of his toxic family was swift and completely unforgiving. Claire and Andre lost their house by the end of the month. My firm legally called in their defaulted bridge loans, and without Terrence to quietly bail them out using stolen corporate funds, they were immediately forced into foreclosure. They had to pack up their suburban life and move into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment across town. Claire had to get a full-time job working the front desk at a local fitness center, which meant she had substantially less time to read her pop psychology books and offer me unsolicited advice on decentering my ego. Miss Ruby lost the only thing she truly cared about, her manufactured social standing. The entire church congregation had witnessed the spectacular collapse of her golden child. The wealthy women she used to gossip with suddenly stopped returning her phone calls. She was no longer the proud, untouchable matriarch of a wealthy dynasty. She was just the mother of a broke fraud who had publicly humiliated his successful wife and lost everything in the process. As for Terrence, reality hit him harder than anyone else. Without his chief executive title, his limitless company credit cards, and his luxury assets, he quickly discovered that his arrogant charm had absolutely no currency in the real world. He ended up taking a job as a mid-level shift manager at a regional shipping warehouse, essentially working the concrete floor for a direct competitor of the company I now owned. Sierra filed for maximum child support the very moment the baby was born, garnishing his already meager hourly wages. He was trapped in the exact financial nightmare he had tried to force onto me. 3 months later, I fulfilled the final promise I had made on that stage. I stood in my backyard on a crisp Tuesday morning, wearing a hard hat and a neon high-visibility vest. I held a remote detonator in my hand, surrounded by a highly paid professional demolition crew. I pressed the button, and the controlled explosive charges cracked violently through the foundation of the $5 million house next door. I watched the massive stone columns crumble to the ground. I watched the imported Italian marble shatter into unrecognizable dust. I watched the luxury nursery Terrence had built for his new family collapse entirely into a pile of gray rubble. By the end of the year, the adjacent lot was completely cleared, leveled, and perfectly landscaped. I hired the absolute best contractors in Atlanta to build a state-of-the-art professional-grade tennis court right over the exact footprint of his betrayal. The first time I stepped onto the freshly painted green court, I hit a perfect serve right over the net, the sound echoing beautifully across my expanded estate. My name is Simone, and I am 35 years old. I am the sole owner of a thriving private equity firm, the majority shareholder of a highly profitable national logistics company, and my backhand has never been stronger. If you are watching this, and you have ever been told to shrink yourself to make room for someone else's fragile ego, let my story be your ultimate warning to them. Never apologize for your success. Never let a mediocre partner or a toxic family convince you that your ambition is a character flaw. And never ever sign a legal document without reading the fine print. Have you ever had to legally outsmart a toxic partner or a manipulative family member? I would love to hear your ultimate survival stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about women who absolutely refuse to play the victim. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that the best revenge is not just living well, it is legally owning the very ground your enemies tried to bury you in. Thank you for watching, and remember, always protect your peace and your portfolio.